Philip Collins. I'm a columnist for The Times, and to some extent the work that the Gates Foundation are doing in this project is directed at me as much as at you, which is to say that perspectives on security and development in media tend to be, shall I say, at times simplistic and rather narrow. It's almost inevitable that we focus on a number, and in both of these arenas there is a number to focus on. One's 2% and one's 0.7%, and that tends to organise the argument about whether that number will ever be hit. We'd spend comparatively little time talking about what we actually purchase with those rather substantial sums of money. And we spend even less time thinking about what the 2.7 might be, which is to say the two budgets have similar objectives, and that's what we're going to try and discuss today. Firstly, what we spend, what we do with that money, but also the extent to which defence and development are similar enterprises with similar objectives, and that they could be and should be more closely integrated in the way we think about things and the way we do things in policy. I'm delighted to say we've got distinguished participants from both sides of that argument. Lieutenant General Sir Robert Fry, who was 30 years in the Royal Marines, and then has had, since that distinguished military career, has also had two other claims to posterity, one being in business as CEO of Hewlett-Packard Europe, amongst other things, and also as a commentator, writer and thinker, and professorships at Reading and fellowship at Oxford. So looking at this question from all of the angles. The Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell MP, I will embarrassed by saying that not so long ago I was chairing an event on development and aid at the Labour Party conference, and I have never heard such flattering recollections of a Secretary of State from a Labour Party audience than I heard on that occasion for Andrew. It was really remarkable. You'd have been very pleased to hear it. And principally because this government has, to my mind, committed to its great credit to it is a target which is in itself not the objective, but nevertheless it's been a very important commitment that the government has stuck with, despite very severe spending pressures and despite the clarion call which is always there to reduce development aid. And that brings us to what we're going to talk about, which is what is the purpose of it, how do we make sure that we spend every penny wisely, and to what extent is it an integrated part of an overall security and defence programme. I'm going to ask both of our contributors to speak for 10 minutes first to kick us off, and then if they provoke me I might ask one or two questions, but I'll come very quickly to you with a view to wrapping up at 10 o'clock. Without any further from me, it's Robert.
Thank you very much indeed. Trouble with introductions like that is whatever follows now would be a disappointment, but I'll give it a go anyway. I want to talk about three things. I want to talk about history, I want to talk about strategy, and I want to talk about effect. So history first, and I guess it starts with a rhetorical question, which is, did we outfight Germany twice in the 20th century? And I think we can make some claim to have done that briefly between the 1st of July 1916, beginning of the Battle of the Somme, until the 11th of November 1918, the end of hostilities. But for the rest of the time, in the 20th century, we didn't outfight them, but we did make much better use of industrial production. We were far better at the generation and the use of intelligence, and above all, we made much better alliances than they did. And if we look even further back, beginning of the modern era, probably the definitive strategic masterclass is the Napoleonic Wars, where by insular position, maritime power, liberal helpings of dosh to allied governments, discretionary interventions in subsidiary land theatres, and turning up for the final battle, and only the final battle, mainly fought by other people's soldiers, that seems to me the way in which you do strategy. And strategy, by that definition, is the compound effect of all of the instruments of national power. It is therefore inconceivable to me that there can be a strategic defence and security review without aid being entirely integrated into the entire process. So that's my first point, historical. My second point is on strategy. We have something called a fiscal deficit. It's the defining political economic issue of our times. No broadsheet is complete without commentary on a daily basis, and careers are made and broken on its wheel. crudely defined, I guess the fiscal deficit is the difference between what we spend and what we raise. And the difference between those two things is debt. Taken over time, it takes aggregate form, and that creates the borrowing requirement. Fortunately, money can be borrowed to mitigate the effects of a fiscal deficit. Seems to me there's an entirely analogous condition, which is the strategic deficit. The strategic deficit is the difference between our scale of international ambition and our ability to discharge it through the traditional instruments of hard power. It was interesting at the beginning of the last review that we had a doctrine of no strategic shrinkage, and in the intervening 5 years the armed forces have been eviscerated. So we very clearly have a gap between those two things. Now, what do you do about that? Well, I think you can do one of three things. First of all, you can reduce your level of ambition, which I think would otherwise be known as strategic austerity, and if it works for Greece, why wouldn't it work for us? Secondly, you can increase the level of funding, and 2% of an expanding economy may go some way to do that, but it's most unlikely to be sufficient, particularly if it brings in all sorts of funding from intelligence and other parts of government spend. Or you can get really clever about the way in which you combine the instruments of power. And a combination of soft and hard power is probably the only feasible solution that we have to make good the strategic deficit. And there's also the fact that we've always been pretty good at the soft power stuff. I've forgotten what the index is, but whatever the index is that ranks soft power on a global basis. We were first in the Olympic year, and we've either been first or second in subsequent years. So currently we seem to be doing this rather well. If we look back historically, the whole 16th century counter-Reformation debate about the British view, which was essentially economic liberalism and religious pluralism, against a Spanish worldview that was broadly based on counter-reformational principles. That is a debate that we won, and the United States is living evidence, manifest evidence, of the way in which that the argument was won over that period of time. We maintained an empire with the lightest imperial touch, dependent far more upon the quality of our governance than the scale of our military interventions. Even what I think is probably the defining hard power instrument that this country has ever produced, which I guess was the Royal Navy, Nelson's Navy, had this extraordinary combination of patriotic fervour, professional excellence, and an absolutely extraordinary business opportunity in prize money. And to be a frigate captain in the time of Nelson's Navy was the easiest way to create an estate in the south of England, to which the geography of Hampshire still attests to this day. So we've always been pretty good at this stuff, and part of the imperial legacy is the ubiquity of the English language, which is both legacy and also a current instrument in the application of soft power. So my second point is that any consideration of strategy that does not include aid is an incomplete thing. And if we are to make good the current strategic deficit that we're confronting at the present time, it is only through the application of soft power that I can see any sort of solution. So those are the sort of the easy bits. Those are the big headlines. Aid is good, aid is indispensable, aid is inalienable to the process. So let me now talk about effects, because this is the difficult bit. This is the small print. The first thing that, the first bit of the small print is that the idea of bringing together soldiers and humanitarians makes for strange bedfellows. Soldiers often look at humanitarians as tree-hugging irrelevances, and humanitarians often look at soldiers as a moral abomination in uniform. Throw in then the role of the Foreign Office, who's never understood why they lost the money in the first place, and you have a really conducive Whitehall mix, and it's easy to see how things get done really well. It's also, we need to get a little bit sort of military technical just for a few seconds. You also need to get into the game of effects. What the military is increasingly about, has been for years, but ever more so as weapons become more sophisticated and more expensive, is not about saying how many rounds have been fired in an artillery fire mission. It is what is the effect that they've had. That's why we love drones. You know, these things that buzz around, and they're invulnerable, they're efficient, they're also highly discriminate. So every bit of military language is captured in terms of effect at the target end. An awful lot of the at least popular debate about aid is volumes, is about the number of rounds fired, is about the 0.7%, or about the countless millions spent in Rwanda or Ethiopia or wherever else it is. And if these two things are to come together in a way which creates greater synchronization, then some of the language of effects has to be applied to aid. Now, I'm sure Andrew will immediately tell me that this is being done all of the time, and I'm sure that's true. But we also then encounter another structural issue, which is the minute that you try and capture soft power and make it subject to some of the strictures of military analysis, it ceases to be soft. Because soft power by its nature must be independent, must be pluralistic, and it is not susceptible to the sort of military management and military measurement which I'm advocating. So if I was to sum up my pitch on this, I think that history and the current strategic debate shows that aid has an absolute central point within the process that we're about to undertake. But a knighthood awaits the person that can work out how to do it.
Robert. Well, thank you very much. You made a fascinating case for and persuasive case for the integration. Can I just press you on one implication of what you said, which you didn't quite say, but I wonder, when you did say the army has been eviscerated lately, with quite a strong word. There's been quite a lot of conversation recently in the press about Britain, in some sense, retiring from a world position. Do you think we're in the process of doing that, whether by design or by accident?
I wouldn't actually look at the British press. I'd look at what everybody else is saying, because we're too wrapped up in this and we can't see the wood for the trees. But when serious commentators in America, albeit from the Republican right, begin to say these sort of things, you need to pay a little bit of attention. I think it's perfectly possible to buy the government's line, which is to say that we are in a period of economic retrenchment, during which we're going to spend very little on certain areas of legitimate governance, but once we're straight again, we will reinvest. The only trouble is it's difficult to see an historical precedent in that. Once you get out of this game, do you ever get back into it? So I would say possibly the jury is out, but if I'm to anticipate a verdict, it is that we have taken some steps back. Okay, well, Andrew, we are, I think, the only G7 nation that meets the 0.7% target on aid, so I think it's a good case for saying we're not retiring in at least that side of the argument.
But more on the military side, because we are, I think, the fourth largest spender on defence, and we certainly have one of the finest and most effective military forces in the world. So in that way I would perhaps dissent very slightly from what the General said.
Yes, please.
I agree with virtually everything that Sir Robert has said this morning, but I want to give you, if you like, a sort of jobbing politician's view of these issues. I start, I think, from the realistic position that the world is in an incomparably less safe and more difficult place now than it was 5 years ago. And I think there are many at the top of government who hope that, having done a great deal over the last 5 years to mend the British economy and to set Britain on a strategically, hopefully a strategically good economic trajectory, we now over the next 5 years need to mend Britain's position in the world. And let me just underline why I think we're in an incomparably worse position now than we were 5 years ago. If you look around the world, the challenges are immense. We'll come to the Middle East, but look at what China is doing in the South China Sea. Look at the predatory nature of Russian intentions. look at the fact that Europe is facing inwards. It's not able to project itself on the world stage. Why? Because we're so worried about Greece, we're worried about the Eurozone, and we're very worried about the migrants who are coming across the Mediterranean. So the problems that face Britain particularly, but much of the world, have got immeasurably worse. And by far the greatest example of this, of course, is in the Middle East. And if you look at that belt of misery which runs from northern Nigeria, with Boko Haram now happily being pressed quite extensively back, but nevertheless a huge destabilizing force in the world. You then go to Mali, where the French had to intervene to save that country from anarchy. The spread of weaponry out of Libya across that part of Africa, through the Central African Republic, where there are millions of people on the move, through Sudan, which still continues to cause immense numbers of deaths, down through Somalia and Al-Shabaab and the destabilization of Kenya, where the terrorists have effectively killed off their tourist industry and are destroying that country, and then up through the Straits into Syria, the greatest catastrophe of our generation, where something like half a country of 10 million people are on the move. 2 million people have gone across the border, 1 million children are now in camps not getting educated, and then we have Iraq, and we have ISIL heading towards a port on the Mediterranean. The position internationally is catastrophic, and it's getting worse. And so it seems to me that the challenge that today's seminar poses is a very good one. What are we going to do in the next few years to try and make our contribution as an internationalist and outward-looking country to these very difficult times? Well, the focus, as the General said, will be on the SDSR, how you spend the 2.7, if you like, how you get the best effectiveness in confronting these issues. The Prime Minister has said that he wants to see more drones and more special forces. If you want to see more special forces, I don't think there's been any time in our history. I am not an armchair general, but you don't need one because we have a real general here. I can't think of any time where you managed to increase the size of the special forces on a diminishing size of the army. And so I think that will be very difficult. On the subject of drones, I think that this opens up a very interesting and difficult question, which I raised briefly in the House of Commons yesterday. For every legitimate target that drones take out, they take out between 5 and 10 innocent civilians, often women and children, and others attending wedding parties. I cannot think of a better recruiting sergeant for the terrorist than unsuccessful drone attacks. So, you know, there is a big debate to be had. The SDSR is the place to have that debate about what we need to do. I sat on the National Security Council for the last SDSR, which was a much better process than the press gave us credit for at the time. The National Security Council is, in my view, one of the best and most significant changes in the machinery of government that has taken place over the last 5 years. When governments start reorganising the machinery of government, you are into a sort of slightly yes minister position. But the National Security Council, I think, works extremely well. And why? Because it brings together defence, diplomacy and development. It addresses the question of how you spend the 2.7%. And I think that this time the SDSR will be a challenging process for everybody. On the last SDSR, both George Osborne and I asked repeatedly why it was that Britain, unlike so many other military forces, with a military of 100,000 in the army, can only ever deploy something like 20,000 in the field, whereas other forces, take the Israelis for example, can get up to about 80%. And we never really got a satisfactory answer to that question. And I think the SDSR this time will build on that and try and make sure that we do more to sweat our military assets than perhaps we have done in the past, quite apart from the other assets which will come to the table during the SDSR. And I think in addition, the extra money, the 2%, will probably be ring-fenced in a pot against which the military have to bid in order to make sure that this extra money is used extremely well. As a result of the last SDSR, 1/3 of the development spending went, if you like, into conflict prevention. And I think that there is a legitimate argument to be had at the moment that having passed a law to say that we will spend the 0.7, yet in an election campaign where you heard almost nothing about development at all, we are in danger of not standing up for a tremendous British achievement, and we need to do that. I told the Prime Minister during the election that if I heard him use the word international development, I would buy him a half pint of bitter and a small cigar. I think my bet was completely safe. We are very timid because of the fear of UKIP and the Conservative Party about what we say about international development. And the truth is that whereas America, if you like, is a military superpower, Britain is a development superpower, not an aid superpower, as the Daily Mail likes to put it, but a development superpower. We do have real effect. And when we came to power in 2010, we set out 4 very clear areas which were essential for development to succeed and which would be our priorities. And those are the areas that in this SDSR we need to bring to the table with the military so that we can answer Phil's question about the 2.7%. And in the last few moments available to me, those 4 areas are very simple. The first is that you have to make sure that DFID is a proper Department of State in Whitehall for development internationally, and not a well-upholstered NGO moored off the coast of Whitehall. It's got to be a clear part of the NSC, and it's got to be a clear contributor to the government's policies in this area. Secondly, you have to demonstrate that the 0.7 that is spent is delivering results. You cannot expect people to support development unless you can show that there are results on the ground, that for every pound you are spending, you are getting 100 pence of delivery. When I was Secretary of State, I used to say to these brilliant officials who populate DFID, how do you explain to Mrs. Jones in Sutton Coldfield that you are spending this money? That is the question, that is the essay question we always have to answer. That's the second point. The third point is that development is about, first and foremost, stopping conflict. Sir Paul Collier once said that conflict is development in reverse. Unless you stop conflict, unless that belt of misery which I described, that arc of unhappiness, is brought to an end, unless you have stability and you end conflict, then you are not going to get any development. That is right at the heart of this. That's why, as I say, 1/3 of development money goes into conflict resolution. And fourth and finally, you have got to promote prosperity. How is it that the poorest people in the world lift themselves out of poverty? It's by being economically active. It's by focusing on women's rights, so that women have the opportunity themselves to decide whether and when they have children through family planning, that they can vaccinate their children, that there is hope. Because in this battle against terrorism, you have got to split off the people who will not put down their weaponry from those who hear the drumbeat of the terrorist message and have some sympathy with it. And that latter group can be split off from the hard men and confronted in the same way that the hard men will have to be confronted. And let me end on this point. There is no doubt in my mind that the battle against the people I have described, those who refuse to put down their weaponry, will have to be fought kinetically. There is no doubt at all that the only solution there is a military solution. But anyone who believes that this conflict in the Middle East is going to be solved by loosing off smart weapons from 30,000 feet is in cloud cuckoo land. It will be won by smart policies. Those are the policies of international development. They are the 4 points that I have made. They are the policies that offer hope to people who are desperately poor, as I say, hear the drumbeat of the terrorist message, but want to be able to show themselves and their children some light at the end of the tunnels, the possibility of educating their children, having basic health care, having somewhere to live, and having structures which mean that the government and the powerful of the day don't systemically thieve all the assets and the money that is available in their community and their country. Now, those are the policies which will help resolve this, as well as military policies and the hoped for results from the SDSR. Thank you very much.